Everyone calls Game of Thrones the greatest show ever made because of the dragons, the betrayals, and one final season fans still argue about. Critics point to the acting, the internet points to the memes, but that's barely half of it. In this video, we explain why Game of Thrones is the greatest TV show of all time. Section 1. The winningest drama in Emmy history. Game of Thrones ended its run as the single most awarded scripted series in the history of the Emmy Awards. Over 8 seasons and 73 episodes, the fantasy drama from HBO built a trophy case that no other show in the medium had ever come close to filling. By the time the series signed off in 2019, it had collected 59 Emmy wins, more than any comedy, drama, or limited series had ever managed in the 7-decade history of the awards. That number alone tells part of the story. But the way the show reached it, piece by piece, season by season, category by category, says even more about why so many people consider it the greatest show television has ever produced. To understand how big 59 wins really is, it helps to look at what came before Game of Thrones. For years, the record for most Emmys ever won by a scripted show belonged to a sitcom called Frasier, which had picked up 37 wins across its own long run. Frasier had held that record for more than a decade, and no drama, no comedy, nothing had managed to catch it. Then, in September of 2016, at the 68th Primetime Emmy Awards, Game of Thrones walked away with 3 major prizes on the main broadcast, winning Outstanding Writing, Outstanding Directing, and Outstanding Drama Series in a single night. Those 3 wins pushed the show's total to 38, officially passing Frasier and making Game of Thrones the new record holder for the most Emmy wins of any scripted series ever made. It was not a close finish. It was a clean break from a record that had stood since the early 2000s, and it happened while the show still had 3 more seasons left to film. That night in 2016 also matters because of who was standing on stage when it happened. George R.R. Martin, the author who wrote the book series the show is based on, joined series creators David Benioff and D.B. Weiss when they accepted the award. Benioff told the crowd that the show had assembled what he believed was one of the best casts ever put together for television. It was a small moment, but it captured something real about the show. Game of Thrones was never just one person's project. It was a partnership between the writer who built the world on paper and the showrunners who had to figure out how to bring thousands of pages of story to a screen. And the Emmy stage that night put both sides of that partnership in the same spotlight. The 38 win total from 2016 was not reached in one ceremony alone. The Emmys are actually split across 2 events each year. There is the main televised show that most people watch, where the big categories like acting, writing, directing, and best series are handed out. And there is an earlier event called the Creative Arts Emmys, which covers the technical side of television, the work that makes a show look and sound the way it does, but rarely gets talked about outside the industry. In the days before the main 2016 ceremony, Game of Thrones picked up 9 wins at the Creative Arts Emmys alone, in categories covering visual effects, editing, sound mixing, makeup, casting, costume design, stunt coordination, and production design. Those 9 wins brought the show's running total to 35 before the main event had even started, meaning the show only needed a handful more to break the all-time record, and it got them. This detail matters because it shows something important about how Game of Thrones earned its reputation. A lot of shows can win an award for a strong lead performance or a well-written finale. Very few shows dominate the technical categories the way Game of Thrones did, year after year, because those wins depend on hundreds of people working behind the camera, getting every detail right at a massive scale. Costume design for a show with dozens of major characters spread across different cultures and climates is a completely different job than costume design for a show set in one office or one city. Makeup and sound mixing for battle scenes with thousands of soldiers is a different job than doing the same work for a courtroom drama. When Game of Thrones swept these categories, it was a sign that the show's excellence went far beyond what happened in front of the camera. The show's Emmy success did not stop in 2016. 2 years later, at the 2018 ceremony, Game of Thrones was back in the running for Season 7, and it added 9 more wins to its total, including Outstanding Drama Series and Outstanding Supporting Actor for Peter Dinklage, who played Tyrion Lannister. Those 9 wins pushed the running tally to 47, breaking the show's own record yet again and stretching its lead even further ahead of every other scripted show in Emmy history. What made this run particularly unusual is that Season 7 had been shifted later in the year, moving from a spring premiere to a summer one, which had actually made the show ineligible for the previous year's Emmy cycle entirely. Despite missing an entire awards cycle because of that scheduling change, the show came back the following year and picked up right where it left off, as if the pause had never happened. Then came the 8th and final season in 2019, and this is where the numbers become almost hard to believe. When the nominations for that year's Emmys were announced, Game of Thrones had received 32 nominations for its final season alone. That was the highest number of nominations any drama series had received in a single year since a police drama called Nip-Tuck Blue set a record back in 1994. In other words, Game of Thrones broke a nomination record that had stood for 25 years, doing it in the same season that many fans and critics felt was the most divisive stretch of the entire show. Whatever complaints people had about how certain storylines ended, the Television Academy clearly still saw a tremendous amount to reward, spread across acting, writing, directing, and a long list of technical categories. At the time those nominations were announced, the show's overall nomination total across its entire run had climbed to 161, with 47 wins already banked from previous seasons. The chairman of the Television Academy at the time, Frank Sherma, commented that seeing Game of Thrones show up again on the nominations list never seemed to get old, even after so many years of the show doing exactly that. It is a small comment, but it reflects how normal it had become for this one show to dominate the conversation every single year it was eligible, to the point where its continued success stopped feeling surprising and started feeling like the expected outcome. When the actual ceremony happened in September of 2019, Game of Thrones added 12 more wins to its total, 10 of which came during the Creative Arts Emmys the week before the main show, with the final 2 arriving during the televised event itself. Those 12 wins tied the show's own record for the most Emmys won by a single season of television, a record it had originally set back in 2015, when Season 5 also picked up 12 wins in one year. This meant that Game of Thrones did not just hold the record for most wins by a series across its whole run. It also held the record, tied with itself, for the most wins earned by any single season of any show in Emmy history. No other program had ever managed to hit that number of wins in one year even once, and Game of Thrones did it twice, 4 years apart, with 2 completely different seasons of content. The 2 wins that came during the main televised ceremony in 2019 were especially significant. The first was Outstanding Drama Series, which Game of Thrones had now won 4 separate times across its run. That 4th win tied it with only 4 other shows in the entire history of the category for most wins ever: Hill Street Blues, The West Wing, LA Law, and Mad Men. Those 4 shows are widely considered some of the most important and influential dramas ever made for American television, spanning decades of storytelling, from the 1980s all the way through the 2010s. Game of Thrones joining that list put it in the same company as programs that shaped entire eras of television, and it did so as the only fantasy series to ever manage the feat. The second big win of that final night belonged to Peter Dinklage, who took home Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Drama Series for his performance as Tyrion Lannister. This was Dinklage's 4th win in that category across the show's run, and it set a new all-time record for the most wins ever earned by an actor in that specific category, breaking a tie he had previously shared with Aaron Paul, who won 3 times for his role in Breaking Bad. Dinklage had been nominated in that category for every single one of the show's 8 seasons, meaning he received a nomination every single year the show aired, without exception. Out of everyone who acted on Game of Thrones across its entire run, including massive stars like Emilia Clarke, Kit Harington, and Lena Headey, Dinklage was the only cast member to ever actually win an Emmy for acting on the show. Several other cast members picked up multiple nominations over the years, including Diana Rigg for her role as Olenna Tyrell, but none of them ever converted a nomination into a win. Dinklage stood alone in that respect, nominated 8 times and winning 4 of those 8 chances, a level of consistency that very few actors on any show ever reach. It is worth taking a moment to sit with how unusual that pattern is. Most shows with large casts spread their acting wins around over time, especially across 8 seasons, as different storylines put different characters in the spotlight. Game of Thrones had one of the largest ensemble casts in television history, with dozens of characters who each had passionate followings and plenty of screen time to make a case for an award. Despite that, only one actor ever broke through to win. This says something about how competitive the acting categories were during those years, with shows like Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, The Crown, and The Handmaid's Tale often competing in the same categories. But it also says something about just how strong Dinklage's specific performance was judged to be by voters, year after year, regardless of who else was nominated alongside him. By the time all the final season wins were tallied, Game of Thrones closed out its Emmy history with 59 total wins and 161 total nominations across 8 seasons. To put that scale in perspective, the show earned more Emmy wins on its own than most entire television networks managed to earn across dozens of different shows over the same stretch of years. It did this while filming across multiple countries, managing a cast that grew to include dozens of speaking roles, and telling one continuous story that had to satisfy both die-hard readers of the book series and millions of viewers who had never picked up a single page of George R.R. Martin's writing. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened quickly. The show built its Emmy reputation slowly across nearly a decade, adding wins in different categories almost every single year it was eligible, rather than winning everything in one big burst and fading afterward. That kind of sustained recognition, spread across writing, directing, acting, and a long list of technical crafts, is much harder to achieve than a single spectacular season that impresses voters once. Voters within the television industry, the same people working on other shows during those years, kept coming back to Game of Thrones again and again, across different showrunners, for different departments, different directors handling different episodes, and different actors carrying different storylines. That kind of repeated, department-wide recognition from people who understand exactly how hard the work is tends to mean more than praise from any single group of critics or fans, because it comes from professionals judging the craft itself. The technical wins deserve one more mention before moving on, because they are often the part of the story that gets overlooked. Winning Outstanding Drama Series or an acting award gets discussed the most, since those are the categories people see handed out live on television. But Game of Thrones built a huge share of its 59 wins through categories most casual viewers never think about, including sound editing, prosthetic makeup, hairstyling, stunt coordination, and visual effects. Each of those wins represents a team of specialists solving a completely different kind of problem. Whether it was designing burn makeup for a character, building a physical set piece that had to survive an actual battle scene being filmed on it, or blending real actors with computer-generated dragons in a way convincing enough to fool millions of viewers into believing it was real. Winning in just one of those categories once is difficult. Winning across almost all of them, repeatedly, across multiple different seasons with different crews rotating in and out, points to a level of consistency across an entire production that very few shows in history have matched. By the time the series ended, Game of Thrones had turned nearly every major category the Emmys offer into a battleground it had already conquered at least once. Most series drama record, tied. Most wins by a single show ever, broken and held alone. Most nominations for a single season, broken. Most wins by a single actor in a specific category, broken. Most Emmys ever collected by any scripted program in the 70-plus year history of the awards, held outright with no other show, even within striking distance. Reaching one of these records would already be a defining achievement for most shows that managed to stay on the air for 8 years. Game of Thrones managed to collect nearly all of them at once, stacking record on top of record until the show simply ran out of categories left to dominate. What makes this even more remarkable is that all of this recognition came for a show built entirely around fictional kingdoms, dragons, and a story that killed off major characters without warning on a fairly regular basis. Fantasy as a genre had never been taken especially seriously by major television awards before Game of Thrones came along. Prestige dramas that swept the Emmys in earlier decades tended to be grounded in realistic settings, whether that meant political offices, police departments, or advertising agencies. Game of Thrones proved that a story built around fictional continents and mythical creatures could be treated with the exact same level of seriousness and respect as any grounded drama, as long as the writing, acting, and craftsmanship behind it were strong enough to earn it. That shift in how fantasy storytelling gets judged by the television industry may end up being one of the show's most lasting effects, long after people stop counting the exact number of trophies sitting in HBO's collection. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of these awards, however, explain the other side of the show's popularity, the side that had nothing to do with critics or industry voters, and everything to do with ordinary people around the world who simply could not wait to watch each new episode the moment it became available, legally or otherwise. Section 2. The most pirated show on Earth. Game of Thrones became one of the strangest success stories in the history of television, because a huge part of its fame came from people who never paid to watch it at all. For 6 years in a row, the show was named the most illegally downloaded television program in the entire world, according to the site Torrent Freak, which tracks and reports on file-sharing activity across the internet. No other show, before or since, has ever managed to hold that title for that many years in a row. Being the most pirated show sounds like a strange thing to be proud of, and in some ways it is not something any network wants to advertise. But the sheer scale of the piracy around Game of Thrones tells a story that award ceremonies never could. It shows just how badly people around the world wanted to watch this particular show the moment it came out, even when they had no legal way to do so where they lived. The story of Game of Thrones and piracy did not start at the end of the show's run. It started early, and it kept building season after season, breaking new records almost every single year the show was on the air. Back in 2012, while the second season was still airing, the show had already become the most pirated program of that spring season, according to Torrent Freak. The numbers at that point were smaller than they would eventually become, but they were still remarkable. The Season 2 finale reached an all-time ratings high for the show at that point, pulling in 4.2 million legal viewers on HBO. At the same time, the illegal downloads for that same episode were nearly as high, sitting at 3.9 million downloads through a file-sharing method called BitTorrent. That number was significant because it beat the previous record holder for the entire year of 2011, a crime drama called Dexter, which had reached 3.6 million downloads at its peak. Game of Thrones had only been on the air for 2 seasons, and it was already outperforming shows that had been running for years when it came to illegal downloads. Interest in the show did not slow down after that. It kept climbing. When the 3rd season finale aired, it set a brand new record for the fastest illegal download numbers ever recorded for a television episode. According to Torrent Freak, around 170,000 people were sharing that single episode at the exact same moment, through file-sharing networks. And more than 1 million illegal downloads were completed within 24 hours of the episode airing on television. A spokesperson from HBO responded to the news at the time by calling it a compliment of sorts, which says a lot about how the network viewed the situation. Rather than treating the piracy purely as a financial loss, HBO seemed to understand that it was also a sign of just how much cultural energy the show had built around itself. One of the actors from the show, Nikolai Coster-Waldau, who played Jaime Lannister, spoke about the strange mix of feelings this created. He admitted there was a small part of him that felt proud the show was the most pirated one out there, while also recognizing that stealing content was clearly not something to feel good about. That tension between pride in the show's popularity and discomfort with how people were accessing it ran through almost every conversation about Game of Thrones and piracy during those years. Australia stood out during this period as one of the countries with the highest number of illegal downloads for the show, followed closely by the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. This detail matters because it points to one of the real reasons piracy around Game of Thrones got so large in the first place. In many countries, fans could not legally watch new episodes at the same time as viewers in the United States. Sometimes they had to wait days, sometimes they had to wait weeks, or even months before the episode became available through their local broadcaster. For fans who were following the show closely, especially in places like Australia, where the wait could stretch on for a long time, illegal downloads became the only way to watch an episode without falling far behind the rest of the world in a story everyone else was already discussing online. The very next year, the show broke its own record again, and this time, the numbers jumped by a huge amount. When the fourth season finale, an episode called The Children, aired in 2014, it drew 7.1 million legal viewers on its first broadcast, which was itself the highest-rated finale the show had produced up to that point. But the illegal download numbers that followed were even more staggering. Within the first 12 hours after the episode aired, roughly 1.5 million people had already downloaded a pirated copy. A tracking service called Demonii reported that at one specific moment, 254,114 people were simultaneously sharing a single file of that episode at the exact same time. That number broke the previous record of around 200,000 simultaneous sharers, which had also belonged to Game of Thrones from the season before. Torrent Freak described this moment as the largest BitTorrent swarm ever recorded, meaning that never before in the history of the internet had that many people gathered around a single shared file at one time. Even among people specifically looking for a high-definition version of the episode, the numbers were huge. The most popular smaller file size version of the episode was being shared by over 108,000 people at once, and a larger, higher quality version had close to 24,000 people connected to it simultaneously. Estimates at the time suggested the total number of illegal downloads for that single episode would likely climb past 7.5 million within just a few days of release. Once repeat viewings and delayed viewings were counted alongside the initial broadcast, the Season 4 finale ended up being seen by 9.3 million people through legal means, which made it the most watched episode in HBO's history up to that point, surpassing the previous record held by another one of the network's most famous shows, The Sopranos. That comparison mattered a great deal at the time, because The Sopranos had been considered one of the gold standards for HBO programming for over a decade. Game of Thrones was not just breaking piracy records anymore. It was starting to break the network's own legal viewership records as well, and it was doing both of those things during the exact same season. The following year, in 2015, the pattern repeated itself once again, and the show once more finished the year as the single most pirated television program in the world, according to Torrent Freak's year-end report. This time, the Season 5 finale alone recorded 14.4 million illegal downloads worldwide. To put that number into perspective, the second most pirated show of that entire year was a zombie drama called The Walking Dead, and its most downloaded episode brought in 6.9 million illegal downloads, which was still less than half of what Game of Thrones managed with just one single episode. Torrent Freak also confirmed that Game of Thrones was not just the most pirated single episode of the year, but the most downloaded show overall across every episode it released that year, meaning its dominance was not limited to a single big finale moment, but stretched across the entire season. What makes the 2015 numbers particularly interesting is that HBO had actually taken real steps that year to try to reduce piracy of the show. Starting with that season, the network arranged for episodes to air on the exact same date around the entire world, rather than staggering the release across different countries at different times, the way it had in earlier years. This was a direct response to one of the most common complaints from international fans, who had often been forced to wait weeks or sometimes months after the American broadcast before they could legally watch a new episode where they lived. Removing that wait was supposed to reduce the temptation to download episodes illegally. Even with that change in place, piracy numbers for the show continued climbing rather than falling. This suggests that waiting time was only ever part of the reason people pirated the show. A large portion of the audience was choosing to download the show illegally, simply because it had become such a massive part of global conversation that people wanted to watch it as fast as humanly possible, through whatever method got them there first, regardless of whether a legal option was already sitting right in front of them. Even while all this illegal activity was happening, the show's legal numbers were also climbing to record levels during that same stretch of years. Around the time of the 2015 piracy numbers, Game of Thrones was drawing close to 20 million viewers per episode, once every form of legal viewing was counted, including streaming, on-demand viewing, and delayed viewing on top of the initial live broadcast. That same year, the show also swept the Emmy Awards with 12 wins, tying its own future record for most Emmys earned by a single season of television. In other words, 2015 was a year where the show was breaking records for piracy, breaking records for legal viewership, and breaking records for awards recognition, all at the exact same time. Very few shows in television history have ever managed to dominate all three of those categories simultaneously, and Game of Thrones did it during a single calendar year, not spread out across its entire run. The show's piracy numbers reached their absolute peak during its 7th season. When the Season 7 finale aired in August of 2017, it set a new all-time high for the show, with a single episode being shared across more than 400,000 different torrent connections at the exact same moment, according to Guinness World Records, which officially recognized Game of Thrones with the world record for most pirated television program that same year. That number, 400,000 simultaneous shares of one single episode, is difficult to fully picture, but it means that at the exact moment that episode was airing on television, a network of pirated file-sharing activity, larger than many small cities in population, was actively passing that one file back and forth across the internet. The scale of piracy around that 7th season did not stop at a single record-breaking finale. Once the full season had finished airing, tracking data showed that Season 7 of Game of Thrones had been pirated a total of 1.03 billion times by early September of that year. That number covers every illegal download and stream across the entire season, not just the finale. To put a billion in perspective, that means the show was pirated roughly by more people than the entire population of most large countries on Earth, spread across just 7 episodes released over a period of a few weeks. Even accounting for the fact that many of those billion downloads likely came from the same people downloading multiple episodes, or the same episode being downloaded more than once by different users, the scale still dwarfed nearly every other piece of media being shared online at that time. By the time the 8th and final season arrived in 2019, HBO estimated that around 17.4 million people were watching through legal means when the premiere aired. Given how consistently piracy numbers for the show had outpaced or matched its legal viewership in earlier seasons, it is reasonable to assume the real total audience for that final season, once illegal viewing is factored in, was significantly higher than the official legal number suggests, even though an exact combined figure was never officially confirmed by any single source. What is confirmed is that HBO spent more than $90 million marketing that final season alone, an enormous investment that reflected how much the network understood the show had become far bigger than a single television program. It had become a kind of global event, something people all over the world were determined to experience the moment it became available, whether that meant turning on HBO the moment it aired or finding whatever illegal method got them there first. One comment from HBO's leadership at the time captured the network's strange relationship with all of this piracy activity. Jeff Bewkes, who was the chief executive of Time Warner, the company that owned HBO during those years, spoke publicly about how the network viewed the issue. He explained that dealing with people sharing subscriptions and finding unauthorized ways to watch the show was nothing new, pointing out that networks had been dealing with some version of this problem for decades, long before Game of Thrones ever existed. His broader point was that piracy, while technically a loss of direct revenue, often ended up working in the network's favor in other ways, since it exposed more people to the show and helped drive the kind of global conversation that eventually led many of those same viewers to subscribe to HBO legitimately once they were hooked on the story. Rather than treating every pirated download as a lost sale, the network seemed to view a portion of that piracy as a strange form of free advertising, one that helped turn Game of Thrones into a show that felt impossible to avoid hearing about, whether someone watched it legally, illegally, or simply through everyone around them talking about it constantly. Taken together, these piracy numbers tell a story that awards and ratings alone cannot fully capture. Emmy wins measure how much respect a show earns from people inside the television industry. Ratings measure how many people are watching through the official channels a network can actually track and monetize. Piracy numbers measure something else entirely. They measure raw, uncontrollable demand, the kind that pushes people to break the law rather than wait even a single day longer to see what happens next in a story. Very few pieces of entertainment in history have ever generated that kind of urgency on a global scale, sustained not for one big moment, but across 6 consecutive years of new seasons. Game of Thrones did not just get watched by a large number of people. It got wanted by a large number of people. Badly enough that hundreds of millions of them were willing to risk breaking the law just to avoid waiting. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of these numbers, staggering as they are, explain how a television show managed to reach a scale where hundreds of millions of people across every continent needed to see it the moment it existed. That kind of demand does not happen by accident, and it does not happen without an enormous amount of money, planning, and physical production work happening behind the scenes long before a single episode ever reaches a screen, legal or otherwise. Section 3. Building Westeros. The budget and scale. Long before Game of Thrones ever became the most awarded show in Emmy history, or the most downloaded show on the internet, it had to actually get made. And making this particular show turned out to be one of the largest and most expensive undertakings in the history of television. Building a fictional world spread across dozens of kingdoms, cities, castles, and coastlines is not something that happens with a small crew and a modest budget. It takes years of planning, an enormous amount of money, and a level of physical construction that most television shows never even attempt. The story of how much Game of Thrones actually cost to make, and where all that money went, says a great deal about why the show ended up looking and feeling the way it did on screen. When Game of Thrones first began, HBO approached the show with real caution. Fantasy as a genre had never been a guaranteed success on television, and a show this ambitious, with dragons, multiple kingdoms, and a cast full of characters spread across an entire continent, was a genuine risk for the network. The budget for the first season reflected that caution. Reports at the time placed the total cost of Season 1 somewhere between $50 million and $60 million for all 10 episodes, which works out to roughly $5 to $6 million per episode on average. That number might sound large on its own, but for a network drama at that time, it was actually a fairly standard budget, not an extravagant one. HBO was willing to invest a meaningful amount of money into the show, but it had not yet fully committed to turning it into the kind of massive production it would eventually become. Much of that first season was filmed across two main locations, Northern Ireland and Malta, a small island country in the Mediterranean Sea. These two locations gave the production access to very different kinds of landscapes within a relatively short distance of each other. Northern Ireland offered green hills, forests, and coastlines that could stand in for the northern parts of the fictional world the show was building, while Malta offered older stone architecture and warmer, sunnier settings that worked well for locations meant to feel more southern and more established. Choosing these two locations early on set a pattern that would continue and expand for the rest of the show's run. Rather than building every single set from scratch in a studio, the production leaned heavily on real-world locations that already looked like they belonged in a fantasy story, only adjusting and building on top of what nature and history had already provided. For the first 5 seasons of the show, the budget stayed fairly close to that original $5 to $6 million per episode range, with only a few real exceptions. The most notable exception came during Season 2, with an episode called Blackwater. That episode focused entirely on a massive naval battle at the gates of a city called King's Landing, and it was the first episode in the show's history to take place in only one location for its entire runtime, rather than jumping between multiple storylines happening in different parts of the world. HBO had approved a budget of $6 million for Season 2 episodes, which was already a small increase from Season 1. But the people running the show wanted to bring the naval battle to life at a much larger scale than that budget allowed, matching the scope of the battle as it had been written in the original books. After some negotiation, the executive producers convinced HBO to approve an additional $2 million specifically for that one episode, along with an extra week of filming to pull it off properly. The final cost of producing Blackwater ended up being around $8 million, which was a significant jump above the standard episode budget at that point in the show's run, and it showed that HBO was willing to spend extra money on individual episodes when the story genuinely called for it. Between roughly 2012 and 2015, covering seasons 2 through 5, the average cost per episode slowly grew from around $6 million up to at least $8 million. This was not a dramatic jump, but it reflected a steady increase in ambition as the show continued and its audience kept growing. Each season introduced more characters, more storylines happening in different parts of the world at the same time, and more complicated visual effects work, particularly as dragons became a bigger part of the story and needed to look convincing on screen. All of that additional complexity costs more money, even when a season is not built around one single giant battle episode the way Blackwater had been. The real turning point for the show's budget came with Season 6. By this point, Game of Thrones had already broken Emmy records, built a massive global audience, and become one of the most talked about shows in the world. HBO responded to that success by significantly increasing what it was willing to spend on the show, approving a total budget of $100 million for that season. Spread across 10 episodes, that works out to an average of about $10 million per episode, a substantial jump from the $8 million average of the previous few seasons. This increase gave the production the resources to attempt bigger and more ambitious sequences than ever before, including what would become one of the most famous episodes in the show's history, an episode called Battle of the Bastards, which required extensive post-production work and complicated logistical planning that went far beyond what earlier seasons had needed to manage. Season 7 kept that same rate of spending, staying at around $10 million per episode, but the season itself was shortened to only 7 episodes instead of the usual 10. This brought the total budget for that season down to roughly $70 million, even though the cost per individual episode had not dropped at all. The decision to shorten the season was made deliberately by the showrunners, who felt that the final stretch of the story needed fewer, more tightly packed episodes, rather than a full 10-episode season stretched out with additional filler content. Filming for these later seasons also began taking longer overall, with extended shooting schedules and more visual effects artists being brought in to handle the growing scale of the work, even though the total number of episodes being produced each year was shrinking. The final season pushed the budget even higher. For its 8th and last season, HBO raised the show's per-episode budget once more, this time to approximately $15 million per episode. With only 6 episodes making up the entire final season, that gave the production a total budget of around $90 million, spent on roughly 2/3 of the episode count that earlier full-length seasons had received. In other words, the final season cost almost as much as the massive $100 million 6th season, despite having 4 fewer episodes to work with. Part of the reason for this jump was that the final 4 episodes of the series were given extended runtimes, running for approximately 80 minutes each, rather than the standard 50 to 60-minute length most earlier episodes had followed. Longer episodes meant more material to film, more visual effects to complete, and more overall production time, all of which added directly to the final cost. Across its entire 8-season run, Game of Thrones aired a total of 73 episodes. Looking at the full picture, the show's budget grew from roughly $5 to $6 million per episode at the very beginning to $15 million per episode by the end, which means the cost of producing a single episode nearly tripled over the course of the show's lifetime. Very few television shows manage to keep growing their budget at that pace, year after year, because doing so requires an audience that keeps growing right alongside it, giving the network confidence that the additional spending will keep paying off. Game of Thrones managed to do exactly that, with its viewership climbing in almost every season, even as the show demanded more and more money to keep producing. A meaningful portion of that growing budget went directly into paying the people who brought the story to life on screen. In the show's early seasons, the cast was made up largely of actors who were not yet major stars, which kept salary costs relatively low, even as the physical production side of the show grew more expensive. As Game of Thrones became a global phenomenon, however, its lead actors became some of the most recognizable performers on television, and their salaries grew to match that new level of fame. By the final seasons, some of the show's biggest stars, including Kit Harington, Emilia Clarke, and Lena Headey, were reportedly earning salaries reaching upward of $500,000 per episode, with total per-episode compensation for the show's very top-tier stars climbing as high as $1.2 million by the end of the series. Even younger cast members who had grown up on the show, such as Sophie Turner and Maisie Williams, were earning salaries reported to be around $175,000 per episode by the later seasons, a substantial amount for actors who had started the show as children years earlier. When a show has a cast as large as Game of Thrones did, with more than a dozen actors regularly appearing across multiple storylines, these individual salaries add up quickly, and they represent one of the biggest ongoing costs behind the growing production budget. The physical scale of the production went far beyond just paying actors, however. As the show continued, its filming locations expanded, well beyond the original Northern Ireland and Malta setup used in Season 1. Croatia became a major filming location, particularly the historic walled city of Dubrovnik, which was used to represent the fictional city of King's Landing, the capital of the story's 7 kingdoms. Iceland became another key location, chosen for its dramatic, icy, and largely empty landscapes, which fit perfectly with the parts of the story set in the far north, beyond the massive wall that separates the known world from the dangerous territory further north. Spain joined the list of filming locations as well, contributing several distinctive sites, including a small island called San Juan de Gaztelugatxe, which became the setting for a location called Dragonstone. Morocco was also used for certain scenes, offering the kind of desert and sun-scorched landscapes needed for storylines set in the eastern parts of the fictional world. Filming across so many different countries created enormous logistical challenges that went far beyond what a typical television show ever has to manage. Moving cast members, crew, equipment, and constructed set pieces between countries required constant coordination around travel, accommodation, government permits, and security, all of which added significant cost on top of the actual filming itself. A show based entirely in one city or one studio complex never has to deal with these kinds of expenses. But Game of Thrones was never interested in staying in one place. Its story demanded a world that felt genuinely large and varied, with different regions looking, feeling, and sounding distinct from one another. And the production team went to real, physical locations around the world to make that feeling authentic, rather than trying to fake it entirely with sets and digital effects. Northern Ireland ended up playing an especially important role throughout the show's run, well beyond its use in the very first season. Part of the reason the country remained such a consistent filming base was financial. Northern Ireland offered significant financial incentives to television and film productions that chose to film there, which helped offset some of the enormous costs the production was facing elsewhere. These incentives made it more affordable for HBO to keep returning to Northern Ireland season after season, building out permanent studio space and infrastructure there, rather than starting from scratch in a new location every single year. Over time, this turned Northern Ireland into something close to a permanent home base for the production, even as the story itself kept moving between many different fictional regions of the world. The cost of Game of Thrones compared to other major television shows of its era highlights just how far ahead of the pack it eventually stood. During the mid-2010s, popular sitcoms like The Big Bang Theory were reportedly spending around $10 million per episode, a number that matched what Game of Thrones was spending at that same point in its run. However, that sitcom budget was driven almost entirely by the salaries of its handful of lead actors, since a half-hour comedy, filmed largely on a small number of indoor sets, simply does not require the kind of physical production scale that a show like Game of Thrones demanded every single week. Game of Thrones was spending a similar amount of money, but almost none of it went toward filming a group of actors sitting in a living room set. Instead, that money went toward building castles, staging battles, filming in multiple countries, and creating visual effects work that no sitcom would ever need. By the time the show reached its final seasons, its per-episode budget of $15 million placed it in a category that very few other television productions had ever reached at that point in television history. Only a small number of extremely high-budget shows produced by other networks and streaming services in the years that followed would eventually approach or exceed numbers in that range. And many of those later shows were made specifically because networks and streaming companies had seen what Game of Thrones proved was possible, both creatively and financially, when it came to television storytelling on a massive scale. All of that money, spread across 73 episodes, 8 seasons and filming locations, stretched across half a dozen countries, existed for one core reason. The show needed its fictional world to feel completely real to the people watching it. A story about kingdoms fighting for control of a continent does not work if the different kingdoms all end up looking the same, or if the castles look obviously fake, or if the landscapes feel like they were filmed in the same 3 fields over and over again. Every dollar spent on flying a crew to Iceland, or building a permanent studio complex in Northern Ireland, or constructing a full-scale replica ship for a naval battle, went toward making sure that when a viewer watched a scene set in the snowy north, and then, minutes later, watched a scene set in a sun-baked desert city, both places felt like they genuinely belonged to the same enormous, believable world. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That enormous budget eventually made possible something that no earlier season of the show had ever attempted: An episode that would take everything the production had learned about staging large-scale action and push it further than it had ever gone before. Getting there required not just money, but months of planning, hundreds of extra crew members, dozens of real horses, and one director willing to figure out how to film chaos in a way that had never quite been captured on a television screen before. Section 4. Battle of the Bastards. How TV's biggest battle was made. By the time Game of Thrones reached its 6th season, the show had already proven it could handle big, memorable moments. It had already staged a massive battle on the water back in Season 2, and it had already spent years building a reputation for spending real money on real sets, in real locations, rather than faking everything with a computer. But nothing the show had done up to that point prepared audiences for what arrived on June 19, 2016, an episode called Battle of the Bastards. This single hour of television ended up becoming one of the most talked about episodes in the history of the series, and the story of how it was actually made shows just how far a television show can push itself when a network, a director, and hundreds of skilled workers all decide to aim for something no one had managed to do before on a weekly television schedule. The episode centered on a conflict between two characters, Jon Snow and Ramsay Bolton, fighting for control of a region called the North. Jon Snow was played by Kit Harington, and Ramsay Bolton was played by Iwan Rheon. The two characters represented opposite ends of the story's moral spectrum, and by this point in the show, years of build-up between them had created a genuine sense that whatever final clash happened between their two armies needed to feel like a true payoff, not just another skirmish. The people making the show understood this pressure clearly, and they decided to build an entire episode around delivering that payoff at the largest possible scale. Making this happen required an enormous amount of planning, long before any cameras started rolling. The battle itself was filmed on a private, 31-acre piece of land near a market town called Saintfield, located in County Down, in Northern Ireland. Finding the right physical location for a battle this size was not a simple task. The show employed a supervising locations manager named Robbie Boak, whose job across the show's run involved constantly searching Northern Ireland for pieces of land, buildings, and landscapes that could be turned into believable parts of the fictional world. For this particular episode, Boak ended up driving more than 8,500 miles scouting locations across Northern Ireland, a distance longer than a round-trip flight from London to New York would cover, if measured on the ground. That number alone shows just how much groundwork went into finding the right open stretch of land, one large enough and flexible enough to host the kind of large-scale battle the showrunners had in mind. Once the location was secured, the physical preparation for filming began. The single one-hour episode ended up taking 25 full days to shoot, and that filming time was preceded by 2 additional weeks of rehearsal, meaning the entire process of preparing for and filming this one episode stretched out across roughly 6 weeks in total. For comparison, many television episodes, even ones for expensive dramas, are filmed in a fraction of that time. Spending 25 days filming a single episode reflects just how much material needed to be captured, how many different camera setups were required, and how carefully the fight choreography needed to be planned and reshot from different angles to make the final battle feel as chaotic and real as it eventually looked on screen. The scale of the crew and equipment needed to pull this off was equally massive. In total, 600 crew members worked on bringing the episode to life, supported by 25 professional stunt performers whose job was to safely perform the most dangerous and physically demanding parts of the battle. 80 real horses were brought in for the shoot, meaning the production had to manage the transportation, care, and safety of dozens of live animals across weeks of filming involving loud noises, weapons, and large crowds of people. Moving all of the necessary equipment required 14 separate 40-foot delivery trucks, and the battlefield itself needed 160 tons of gravel spread across the location to create the right kind of muddy, churned-up battlefield surface the story called for. None of these numbers include the actors, the director, or the many other specialists working behind the scenes. They represent only the raw physical materials and manpower needed just to build and support the battlefield itself. More than 500 extras were hired specifically for the battle sequence, on top of the show's already large group of background performers used throughout the season. Across the entirety of Season 6, the show cast a total of 2,395 extras, and when every single day those extras worked is added together, it comes out to 13,717 working days, which is the equivalent of more than 37 years of work spread across one single season of television. That statistic captures something important about how Game of Thrones operated behind the scenes. A story that looks enormous on screen, with crowded battlefields and busy city streets, only looks that way because an enormous number of real people were actually hired, dressed, positioned, and filmed to create that sense of scale. Of the 75 new roles specifically cast for Season 6, 45 went directly to talent from Northern Ireland itself, meaning the local community was not just providing land and studio space for the show, but also a significant portion of the actual performers appearing on screen. Behind the scenes, a weapons master named Tommy Dunn led a team responsible for creating the physical weapons and equipment the armies used during the fight. For the battle sequence specifically, Dunn's team was given just 3 weeks' notice to build 100 large protective shields called Pavice shields, each one standing 6 feet 6 inches tall and 2 feet wide. Building 100 shields of that size in only 3 weeks required an intense, focused effort from the weapons department, working under a tight deadline to have everything ready in time for filming. These shields joined a much larger collection of handmade items the show had built up over its run, with the weapons department maintaining more than 2,000 handcrafted swords, bows, arrows, spears, and artificial corpses stored inside an armory department located at Titanic Studios in Belfast, which served as one of the show's main production bases throughout its time filming in Northern Ireland. Once all of the physical filming was completed, the footage moved into a completely different phase of work, handled by a visual effects company based in Melbourne, Australia, called Illura. This team had never worked on Game of Thrones before taking on this particular episode, meaning their very first assignment on the show was jumping straight into what was, at that point, the single biggest and most technically demanding episode the series had ever attempted. Illura spent 8 months working on the episode, with a team of 120 people dedicated to the project. Their job involved combining the 70 real horses that had been filmed on location with hundreds of background performers and additional computer-generated soldiers, horses, and battlefield elements, blending everything together into what would eventually become 22 full minutes of continuous battle footage within the finished episode. To manage a task of this size, Illura relied on a specialized computer program called Massive, a system originally developed by a visual effects company connected to filmmaker Peter Jackson, who had used similar large-scale crowd simulation technology while making his own films years earlier. This program allowed the visual effects team to simulate enormous crowds of soldiers, with each individual computer-generated character able to move and react somewhat independently, following patterns based on their surroundings and the actions of other characters near them, rather than having every single figure in the crowd move in an identical, repeated pattern. Blending these computer-generated crowds convincingly with the real actors, real horses, and real stunt performers filmed on location required careful, painstaking adjustment, making sure that every visual element, whether real or computer-generated, matched in lighting, movement, and scale so that the final footage looked like one single, unified battle, rather than a patchwork of separate pieces stitched together. The end result of all this work spoke for itself once the episode aired. Battle of the Bastards received a 98% approval rating on the review aggregation site Rotten Tomatoes, based on 65 separate reviews, an extremely high score for any piece of television. Critics reviewing the episode frequently praised director Miguel Sapochnik for his handling of the battle's chaos, highlighting his decision to use handheld cameras that stayed close to the stunt performers on the ground, a technique that helped make the fighting feel disorienting and dangerous in a way that felt closer to how an actual foot soldier might experience being caught inside a real battle. The entertainment website IGN gave the episode a perfect score of 10 out of 10, specifically praising how the battle escalated into what the reviewer called a phenomenal clash of swords and shields, one that paid off an entire season's worth of build-up while also pushing forward the character development of Jon Snow as a leader. When it came time for that year's Emmy Awards, the episode's achievements were officially recognized at the highest level. Miguel Sapochnik won the award for Outstanding Directing for a Drama Series, and the show's creators, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, won for Outstanding Writing for a Drama Series, both specifically tied to this episode. Sapochnik also won a separate award from the Directors Guild of America, an organization made up of directors working across the film and television industry, further confirming that his peers within the directing profession recognized the technical achievement represented by this particular hour of television. Kit Harington, who played Jon Snow, personally selected Battle of the Bastards as the episode he wanted considered when he submitted his own performance for an Emmy nomination that year in the Outstanding Supporting Actor category, choosing this specific episode as the best representation of his work on the show. When the episode first aired on television in the United States, it drew an initial broadcast audience of 7,660,000 viewers, a very strong number for the show at that point in its run, especially considering that audience number reflects only the very first airing, before additional viewers caught up through repeat broadcasts, on-demand viewing, or streaming in the days and weeks that followed. The episode also holds a specific, memorable place within the story of the show itself, since it marked the final appearances of several long-running characters whose storylines came to a close during the events of that single hour, closing out plot threads that had been building for multiple seasons leading up to this moment. Taken together, every number connected to this single episode tells the same underlying story from a slightly different angle. 25 days of filming, 600 crew members, 80 real horses, 500 extras, hired specifically for this one battle, 8 months of additional work from a visual effects team on the other side of the world, 2 Emmy wins and a Directors Guild Award, a 98% critic approval rating. Every single one of these numbers represents a different group of people, working on a different piece of the puzzle, all aimed at producing one continuous, believable hour of television depicting a fictional war between 2 armies that never actually existed. Very few television productions have ever assembled this many resources, this much planning, and this much specialized skill behind a single episode. And the fact that Game of Thrones did it as part of its regular, ongoing weekly schedule, rather than as some kind of separate one-time special event, says a great deal about how differently this particular show approached the idea of what a normal episode of television could look like. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Northern Ireland, where this battle was filmed, had spent years turning from a quiet backdrop into a real destination people traveled to specifically because of what happened there. The same land and crews that built an Emmy-winning battlefield were, at the same time, becoming part of a very different story, one involving tour buses, souvenir shops, and visitors from around the world walking the same ground where Jon Snow and Ramsay Bolton's armies once collided on screen. Section 5. A world-changing tourist attraction. Long after the cameras stopped rolling on Battle of the Bastards, the land, cities, and coastlines used to build the fictional world of Game of Thrones kept working. They just started working for a different industry entirely. Tourism boards, tour companies, hotel owners, and small local businesses across several countries spent the years the show was airing and the years after it ended turning real-world filming locations into destinations that millions of people specifically chose to visit because of a television show. Very few pieces of entertainment in history have ever reshaped the tourism industry of multiple countries at once. But Game of Thrones managed to do exactly that, and the numbers behind this shift are just as remarkable as anything the show achieved through awards or ratings. Croatia became the clearest example of this effect, and within Croatia, one city stood above all others. Dubrovnik, a historic walled city on the Adriatic coast, had already been a well-known tourist spot before Game of Thrones arrived, valued for its medieval architecture and its status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a title given by the United Nations to places considered important enough to protect and preserve for the entire world. HBO began filming in Dubrovnik during production of the show's second season back in 2011, using the city's old town to represent King's Landing, the capital city of the fictional Seven Kingdoms, and one of the most important locations in the entire story. Once those episodes aired and fans realized the real city behind the fictional setting, Dubrovnik's tourism numbers began climbing in a way local officials directly connected to the show. A research study conducted by economists from the Zagreb Institute of Economics and Johannes Kepler University Linz set out to measure exactly how much of that tourism increase could be tied specifically to Game of Thrones rather than other factors. Their findings showed that roughly 60,000 people were visiting Dubrovnik every single year for the sole reason that Game of Thrones had been filmed there, with no other motivation driving the trip. Looking at a slightly longer window of time, the same researchers found that between 2012 and 2015 alone, 244,415 tourists visited Dubrovnik, specifically because of its connection to the show, and those visitors spent a combined 126 million euros, which converts to roughly $147 million during their trips. That is a significant amount of money flowing into one single city's economy, generated almost entirely by fans wanting to see a real place they had only previously watched appear as a fictional setting on their television screens. The researchers behind that study also discovered something else worth noting. The economic boost from Game of Thrones tourism did not stay contained within Dubrovnik itself. Their data showed clear evidence of what they described as spillover effects, meaning the increase in visitors to Dubrovnik also created a positive ripple effect on tourism in nearby counties, and even across the country of Croatia as a whole. A single television show filming in one specific city ended up boosting travel and spending in surrounding regions that had little or nothing to do with the show directly, simply because tourists visiting Dubrovnik for its Game of Thrones connection often extended their trips to explore more of the surrounding area while they were already in the country. The scale of this tourism boost became large enough that it eventually created problems Dubrovnik had never faced before. By 2018, the flow of visitors connected to the show had become so significant that the city began experiencing serious overcrowding during peak tourist season, a level of tourist traffic that put real strain on the city's infrastructure and raised genuine concerns about the long-term condition of a site that held official UNESCO World Heritage status. In response, city officials in Dubrovnik began actively working on what is sometimes called demarketing, essentially the opposite of normal tourism promotion, where a destination intentionally tries to manage or slow down the flow of visitors rather than attract even more of them, specifically to protect the historic site from being damaged or worn down by an overwhelming number of tourists walking through it every single day. Even with those concerns, the overall tourism numbers for the city kept climbing in the years that followed. According to figures published by the Croatian Ministry of Tourism, Dubrovnik reached 1.6 million visitors in a single recent year, and tourism reports specifically noted that the city had become recognized not only for its historical heritage and coastal scenery, but also as the real-world backdrop for several major films and television shows, with Game of Thrones standing out as the most significant example driving that recognition. Some analyses have pointed to Dubrovnik experiencing roughly 20% annual tourism growth tied to its association with the show, a pace of growth that would be considered extraordinary for almost any city, let alone one that was already a well-established travel destination before the show ever arrived. Local tour companies responded to this demand by building entire businesses around the show's connection to the city. A company called King's Landing Dubrovnik began offering walking tours, specifically built around exploring the city's UNESCO-listed Old Town through the lens of the fictional world of Westeros, giving fans a guided experience of recognizing real streets, walls, and buildings as the exact locations where specific scenes from the show had been filmed. The Croatian Tourist Office went a step further, publishing an official map highlighting 16 separate filming locations scattered throughout Dubrovnik, essentially creating an official, government-endorsed guide for fans wanting to retrace the show's footsteps through the real city. Some tour operators even built experiences, allowing fans to sit inside a real Iron Throne prop used during the making of the series, giving visitors a chance to physically interact with a piece of the show rather than simply looking at buildings from a distance. Dubrovnik was not the only part of Croatia to benefit from this effect. Near the city of Split, a historic fortress called Klis Fort had served as the setting for a fictional city called Marine during the show's run. Before the show filmed there, Klis Fort attracted fewer than 10,000 visitors annually, a modest number for a historic site that had existed for centuries without much international attention. After the series aired, the episodes filmed there, the same fortress began attracting more than 100,000 visitors every single year, an increase of more than 10 times its previous attendance, and the price of admission to the fortress reportedly increased by a similar factor as demand grew. A similar pattern played out at Lovrejanek Fortress, a separate historic site in Dubrovnik that had been used to represent the Red Keep, the royal palace at the center of the fictional capital city, which saw a comparable jump in visitor interest once fans connected the real fortress to its fictional counterpart. Croatia was far from the only country that experienced this kind of transformation. Spain also became a significant filming location for the show during its later seasons, and one specific site there ended up seeing perhaps the single most dramatic tourism increase connected to Game of Thrones anywhere in the world. A small island called San Juan de Gaztelugatxe, located off the northern coast of Spain, was used as the setting for Dragonstone, the ancestral home of House Targaryen, and an important location throughout the story. Before the show filmed there in 2017, the island attracted roughly 2,000 visitors in an entire year, a number reflecting its status as a relatively obscure, out-of-the-way natural landmark known mostly to local residents. After the show's 7th season aired, featuring scenes filmed on the island, visitor numbers jumped to approximately 150,000 people annually, an increase of roughly 75 times its previous attendance. Some more recent estimates place the growth even higher, describing an increase of around 300% in visitors compared to earlier levels, a surge so large that local authorities eventually had to introduce a ticketing system just to manage the flow of people trying to visit the island. Something that had never been necessary before the show brought the location into the spotlight. A nearby coastal town in Spain called Bermeo also adapted quickly to the sudden wave of interest connected to the show. Local business owners in the area worked to combine the show's popularity with the region's existing culinary traditions, particularly a type of small snack food called pinchos, which is a well-known specialty of the Basque region of Spain, where Bermeo is located. When the show's 7th season was released in 2017, bar owners in the town launched what they called a Game of Thrones pinchos route, essentially a guided food tour that let visitors sample local dishes while exploring the town's connection to the show, blending the region's existing food culture with its newfound fame as a filming location. Northern Ireland, the country most closely associated with the show throughout its entire 8-season run, experienced its own significant economic boost, tied directly to tourism, A report published in 2018 specifically noted that Game of Thrones was adding almost $40 million in tourism revenue to Northern Ireland every single year. A substantial contribution to the local economy generated almost entirely by fans traveling specifically to see real locations connected to the show. Since 2013, Northern Ireland had built up a total of 25 separate themed tours related to the show, ranging from simple bus tours that drove past major filming locations to more detailed gastronomic tours combining local food and drink with a guided exploration of the show's connection to the region. Tour companies reported that demand for these experiences grew strong enough that several operators increased the capacity of their tours, specifically adding daily tours during peak summer season to keep up with the volume of visitors wanting to book a spot. One particular filming location in Northern Ireland became especially famous, purely because of its visual connection to the show. A stretch of road, lined with old, twisted beech trees, known as the Dark Hedges, had existed for a very long time before the show ever filmed there, planted originally by a local family more than 2 centuries earlier. Once the location appeared on screen as part of the fictional King's Road within the show, interest in the site exploded, with search interest for the location reportedly spiking by roughly 190%, and the road eventually becoming recognized as one of the most photographed avenues of trees anywhere in the world, almost entirely due to its connection to the series. Taken together, the tourism effect created by Game of Thrones represents something that very few television shows have ever managed to produce. Most successful shows leave behind strong ratings, award nominations, and passionate fan communities that discuss the story online for years afterward. Game of Thrones did all of that, but it also physically reshaped the economies of specific cities, towns, and even small islands scattered across multiple countries, sending real money and real visitors toward locations that, in some cases, had barely registered on the radar of international travelers before the show existed. A fortress in Croatia that once saw 10,000 visitors a year began seeing over 100,000. An island off the coast of Spain that once saw 2,000 visitors a year began seeing well over 100,000, forcing local authorities to introduce a ticketing system just to keep up. A road lined with old trees in Northern Ireland became one of the most photographed places on the planet. None of these locations set out to become global tourist attractions. They became famous because a television show decided their natural beauty and historic character were exactly what its story needed. And once millions of viewers around the world saw those places on screen, a significant number of them decided they needed to see it for themselves in person. This kind of impact tends to fade quickly for most shows, since audiences move on to new favorites within a year or two, and interest in visiting old filming locations drops off along with it. Game of Thrones tourism numbers, however, have shown remarkable staying power even years after the series finale aired. Reports from Dubrovnik several years after the show ended described Game of Thrones tourism as still thriving, with local guides noting that tours based on the show had become a completely mainstream activity for visitors, not a fading novelty tied to a show that had already left the air. This kind of long-term staying power suggests that the connection between the show and these locations became something closer to permanent, woven into how these places are marketed and understood by travelers, rather than a short-lived trend that faded once new episodes stopped being released. The scale of interest generated by these real-world locations also points to something important about how deeply people connected with the fictional world the show built. Fans were not simply enjoying an interesting story from the comfort of their own homes. Millions of them felt strongly enough about the world of Westeros that they were willing to spend real money traveling across oceans, specifically to stand in the exact spots where their favorite characters had once stood, even though nothing about those locations was fictional in real life. That level of emotional investment, strong enough to translate directly into airline tickets, hotel bookings, and guided tour purchases, says a great deal about how thoroughly the show managed to make its world feel real and worth experiencing firsthand, rather than something that only existed within episodes watched on a screen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Building a world convincing enough to inspire that kind of devotion did not happen through locations and budgets alone. None of these places, however beautiful or historic, would have meant anything to fans without the characters who lived and fought and died within them, brought to life by one of the largest and most unusual casts ever assembled for a single television series, a group of actors who took on roles that, in many cases, would end up defining the rest of their careers. Section 6. The ensemble nobody thought would work. Every award Game of Thrones ever won, and every tourist who ever stepped foot on one of its filming locations, existed because of a group of people who were not writers, directors, or camera operators. They were casting professionals, working quietly behind the scenes years before any episode aired, tasked with finding actual human beings who could convincingly play characters spread across an entire fictional continent. Building the cast of Game of Thrones turned out to be its own kind of massive undertaking, one that started small and grew into one of the largest and most unusual ensembles ever assembled for television. And the story behind how that cast came together explains a great deal about why so many of these performances still stick in people's minds years after the show ended. Right from the very first season, Game of Thrones set a new standard, simply in terms of size. According to records kept about the production, the first season alone featured 250 speaking roles, with almost 90 of those characters given actual names within the story. At the time the show debuted, that made it the largest cast ever assembled for a single season of any HBO project up to that point. This was before the show had even proven itself as a success. HBO was committing to a cast size that large for a brand new fantasy series, with no guarantee that audiences would connect with it at all, and that scale only grew larger once the show moved into its second and third seasons, as new regions of the fictional world were introduced, and new storylines demanded new characters to carry them. Managing a cast of that size required a specific kind of expertise, and much of the responsibility for finding the right people fell to a casting director named Nina Gold, based in London. Gold had already built a reputation in the industry before Game of Thrones ever came along, having worked as the casting director on an earlier HBO series called Rome, which had also required assembling a large historical ensemble spread across multiple countries. That earlier experience made her a natural fit for a project as ambitious as Game of Thrones, though by her own account, taking on the job was not something she had originally been eager to do. In interviews given years later, Gold described her first reaction to the offer as lukewarm, saying it was not really her cup of tea when she was first approached about the project, before eventually taking on the role that would end up defining a large part of her career. Gold's approach to casting Game of Thrones became known for something specific, a willingness to mix well-known, experienced actors with performers who were almost entirely unknown at the time. Actors like Sean Bean, who had already built a long career in film before joining the show, and Charles Dance, another established performer, were cast alongside young or relatively unfamiliar actors who had little to no major screen experience before landing their roles. This mixture was not accidental. It reflected a specific philosophy Gold has spoken about in interviews, describing her preference for discovering unknown actors and taking real risks on unproven talent, rather than simply filling every role with recognizable faces who came with guaranteed audience recognition, but might not actually be the best fit for the character. One of the clearest examples of this approach involved the casting of Arya Stark, one of the show's most important young characters. To find the right performer for that specific role, Gold auditioned more than 200 separate actresses before eventually selecting Maisie Williams, who had no major professional acting credits at the time she was cast. Auditioning over 200 people for a single role is an enormous undertaking on its own. And it reflects just how seriously the casting process treated even roles that, on paper, belong to a child character rather than one of the show's more obviously central adult leads. That level of care ended up paying off enormously, since Williams went on to play the role across the entire 8-season run of the show, growing from a child actor into an adult performer while continuing to play the same character the entire time, something very few young actors ever get the chance to do on a single ongoing series. A similar pattern played out with another major young performer on the show, Sophie Turner, who was cast to play Sansa Stark. Like Williams, Turner had little previous acting experience before joining the show. And like Williams, she remained with the production for its entire run, aging alongside her character across 8 years of filming. Isaac Hempstead Wright, cast as Bran Stark, followed this same pattern as well, joining the show as a young child actor and staying with the role all the way through to the series finale years later, finding young performers capable of carrying major, emotionally demanding roles across nearly a decade of filming, while also growing and improving as actors in real time, represented its own unique casting challenge that few other shows in television history have had to manage at this particular scale. Not every notable casting decision on the show involved searching through hundreds of auditions. Sometimes the process worked in the opposite direction, built around a casting director simply remembering someone from years earlier. Gold has specifically described the casting of a character named Hodor, played by an actor named Christian Nairn, as one of her favorite casting stories from the entire show. She first met Nairn years before Game of Thrones existed, when he auditioned for a completely different project, a comedy film called Hot Fuzz. Nairn did not end up appearing in that film, but Gold remembered him clearly enough that when the search began years later for an actor capable of playing Hodor, a large, gentle character with very limited dialogue but enormous physical presence, she thought of Nairn immediately. Gold has openly stated that Hodor became one of her favorite characters from the entire show, a role built almost entirely around a single casting director's memory of one actor from an unrelated audition that happened long before Game of Thrones was ever written. The scale and difficulty of casting a show like this did not go unnoticed by the television industry. Casting itself is recognized as its own official category at the Emmy Awards, honoring the specific work of finding and assembling the right performers for a production, separate entirely from the awards given to the actors themselves. Nina Gold, working alongside fellow casting directors Robert Stern and, in later seasons, Carla Strong, won the Emmy for Outstanding Casting for a Drama Series on multiple separate occasions for her work on Game of Thrones, with recognized wins tied to Season 5 in 2015, Season 6 in 2016, and Season 8 in 2019. Winning that specific award more than once, across different seasons of the same show, reflects a level of consistency that voters within the industry clearly noticed. Recognizing that assembling this particular ensemble was not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing challenge, the casting team kept meeting successfully, year after year, even as the demands of the story kept shifting and new characters kept needing to be found. What makes the show's casting story even more interesting is how differently individual actors' careers were shaped by joining this specific project. Peter Dinklage had already worked as an actor before Game of Thrones, but the role of Tyrion Lannister turned him into one of the most recognized performers on television, eventually earning him 4 separate Emmy wins across the show's run, a record within his specific acting category that no other performer has matched. Emilia Clarke, cast as Daenerys Targaryen, and Kit Harington, cast as Jon Snow, both became globally recognized actors, largely because of the roles they played on this one show, appearing in magazine covers, major interviews, and public events around the world in a way that would have been difficult to predict when they were first cast in a fantasy series that had not yet proven it could find an audience. At the same time, the show became known for treating its cast in a way that many other major dramas historically had not, refusing to guarantee long-term safety for any character, regardless of how central they seemed to the overall story. Sean Bean, playing Ned Stark, was positioned in the show's marketing and early episodes as one of its clear central characters. The kind of role that on most other television dramas would be expected to remain part of the story for years. Bean's character was killed within the first season, a decision that immediately signaled to audiences that the normal rules of television casting simply did not apply to this particular show. No actor, no matter how prominently featured, was guaranteed to remain part of the story, and this reality shaped how audiences watched every casting decision that followed, never fully able to relax into assuming any character, however important, was safe from being written out of the story at any moment. This unpredictability created a strange and unusual dynamic for the actors themselves, one that set the show apart from almost anything else on television at the time. Being cast in a major role on Game of Thrones did not come with the usual sense of job security that a leading role on a successful drama typically provides. Actors joining the cast understood, at least in general terms, that the story was built around a willingness to remove major characters without warning, regardless of their popularity or importance to the plot. This turned casting announcements and character deaths into genuine, unpredictable events that audiences followed closely, since there was no reliable pattern to when a beloved character might suddenly be written out of the story. Very few shows have ever managed to make their actual casting decisions feel like part of the suspense of the story itself. But Game of Thrones consistently did exactly that. Diversity within the cast became a subject Gold addressed directly in interviews given during the show's run, acknowledging criticism the production received regarding the overall makeup of its ensemble. She pointed to the specific nature of the source material as part of the explanation, noting that the books the show was based on described the physical appearance of many characters in detailed terms, which shaped some of the casting decisions made for characters tied closely to those specific descriptions. At the same time, Gold spoke about taking diverse casting seriously as a broader principle in her work, describing efforts to reflect a wider range of backgrounds within casting decisions, where the story allowed for that flexibility, a conversation that continued to evolve as the show progressed through its later seasons. Gold's work on Game of Thrones also became something she carried forward into other major projects after the show ended, further cementing her reputation within the industry as one of the leading casting directors working in television and film. She went on to cast other large-scale, high-profile productions, including the Netflix series The Crown, another show built around an enormous ensemble spread across multiple decades of a single ongoing story. In interviews reflecting on both projects, Gold has described her general approach to casting large ensembles as something built on instinct and feeling, rather than a rigid formula, explaining that finding the right actor for a role comes down to sensing who can genuinely embody a character's essence, whether that character is based on a real historical figure, or, as was almost always the case on Game of Thrones, someone who exists purely within a fictional world built from scratch. The overall effect of this casting approach shaped how audiences experienced the show in ways that went beyond any single performance. Because the cast mixed established actors with complete unknowns, viewers could never rely on recognizing an actor's face as a signal for how important or safe a character was likely to be within the story. A performer nobody had ever seen before could turn out to be central to the plot for years, while a familiar, well-known face might disappear from the story within a single season. This unpredictability, built directly into the casting choices themselves, reinforced the same sense of uncertainty that defined the show's writing, creating a viewing experience where almost nothing about who mattered and who was safe could be assumed in advance, based purely on how recognizable an actor happened to be. By the time the show reached its final season, the ensemble that had started with 250 speaking roles in its first year had grown and evolved dramatically, with many original cast members long gone from the story, and entirely new characters having risen to prominence in their place. Throughout all of that change, The casting team behind the show kept doing the same work that had defined the project since its earliest days, searching for performers capable of disappearing into a fictional world, convincingly enough that millions of viewers around the globe would forget they were watching actors at all, and would instead feel, at least for 1 hour each week, like they were watching real people living through the events of an entirely different world. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That sense of a real, lived-in world did not come only from the actors standing in front of the cameras. It also came from an enormous, carefully coordinated effort happening behind the scenes each week to guarantee millions of people around the globe could actually sit down and watch these performances at the exact same time. A challenge that grew more complicated with every passing season as the show's audience kept expanding into more countries than almost anyone involved with the project had originally expected. Section 7. Ratings, Records, and Global Viewership Growth. Long before Game of Thrones became the show most people think of when they picture peak television, it was actually a fairly modest performer by the numbers. Its very first season did not open to enormous ratings, and nobody working on the show in 2011 could have known for certain that it would eventually grow into the most watched drama in the history of its network. What makes the ratings story of Game of Thrones so remarkable is not that it started as an instant hit. It is that the show kept growing, season after season, at a pace that almost no other television drama has ever managed to sustain for that long, eventually shattering ratings records that had stood for years. According to figures released by HBO, which count total viewership across a full month of viewing after each season ends, including streaming and repeat airings, the show's very first season averaged 9.3 million viewers across the entire United States. That number represented a reasonably solid start for a brand new fantasy drama on a premium channel that people had to specifically pay extra money to access. But it was nowhere close to the numbers the show would eventually reach. From that starting point, the show's audience grew every single season without exception, a pattern that is unusual on its own, since most long-running dramas tend to see their ratings rise for a few years before leveling off or slowly declining as viewers move on to other shows. Season 2 grew to 11.6 million viewers. Season 3 climbed to 14.4 million. Season 4 reached 19.1 million, already more than double where the show had started just 3 seasons earlier. Season 5 marked an important turning point in how people were able to watch the show at all. In April of 2015, HBO launched a new streaming service called HBO Now, timed specifically to coincide with that season's premiere. Unlike the network's earlier streaming option, HBO Go, which required an existing cable subscription to access, HBO Now allowed people to subscribe directly over the internet without needing a traditional cable package at all. This mattered enormously for a show like Game of Thrones, since it removed one of the biggest barriers standing between potential viewers and the series, particularly for younger audiences who were increasingly choosing not to pay for cable television in the first place. With this new option in place, Season 5's average viewership climbed to 20.2 million, and one data analysis, looking specifically at HBO's own viewership figures, found that Season 5 was, by that measurement, the single most watched season of the entire show, narrowly edging out the seasons that followed, once every form of viewing was counted, including repeat airings and streaming activity spread out over the following weeks. The growth did not stop there. Season 6 jumped to an average of 25.7 million viewers per episode, and Season 7 climbed even further to 32.8 million, according to HBO's own reporting. Looking at that full run of numbers from Season 1 through Season 7, the show's average audience grew by roughly 3.5 times over, climbing from 9.3 million all the way up to 32.8 million using HBO's counting method, which includes streaming and viewing that happens up to a month after an episode first airs. Using a different, more traditional counting method from the ratings company Nielsen, which only counts viewing up to 7 days after an episode airs rather than a full month. The show's growth appears even sharper, with some comparisons showing the audience roughly quadrupling in size across that same stretch of seasons. Whichever counting method is used, the underlying pattern stays the same. This was a show that kept finding new viewers every single year it was on the air, for 7 consecutive seasons in a row, without a single season where the audience actually shrank compared to the one before it. This growth pattern becomes even more impressive when placed next to how television access works. HBO has never been a channel that simply comes with a basic television package. Viewers have always needed to pay for it specifically, on top of whatever other television service they already had. And, at the time the show's final season was airing, HBO was estimated to be available in around 35 million households across the United States, which was only about a third of the number of homes that could access major broadcast networks like CBS, NBC, and ABC without any extra payment required. Despite starting from that smaller potential audience, Game of Thrones eventually grew into the single most watched program in the history of a network that had already been running since 1978. A network with decades of experience, producing acclaimed, popular television before Game of Thrones ever premiered. The final season pushed nearly every ratings record the show had already set even further. When the 8th season premiere aired on April 14, 2019, it drew 17.4 million viewers across every platform HBO offered, combining the traditional television broadcast with streaming through HBO Go and HBO Now. Of that total, 11.8 million people watched the episode the traditional way, tuning in live on the channel itself at 9 in the evening, which on its own already outperformed the previous season's premiere by a wide margin. This premiere became, according to Nielsen, the single most watched one-day event in HBO's entire history up to that point, surpassing every other broadcast the network had ever aired since it first went on air more than 4 decades earlier. HBO also reported that the premiere created the largest single night of streaming activity the network had ever recorded, and that it became the most talked about episode in the show's history on social media, generating more than 5 million posts on the platform, then known as Twitter, over that one weekend alone, with the total number of related posts and mentions climbing past 11 million once the entire weekend was counted. From that premiere, the ratings kept climbing higher, with almost every episode that followed. An episode called The Long Night drew 17.8 million viewers across every platform, briefly becoming the highest-rated episode in the show's history. That record did not last long, because the following episode, The Bells, pulled in 18.4 million viewers, breaking the record the previous episode had only just set 1 week earlier. Then, on May 19, 2019, the series finale aired, and it broke the record one final time, drawing a combined 19.3 million viewers across every way HBO allowed people to watch, including 13.6 million who tuned in through the traditional broadcast that evening. That live broadcast number on its own set a brand new record for the most watched single television event in HBO's entire history, surpassing a record that had been held for nearly 17 years by a different HBO series, The Sopranos, whose Season 4 premiere back in September of 2002 had drawn 13.4 million viewers. Game of Thrones did not just beat that older record. It replaced one legendary HBO drama at the very top of the network's own history, with a different, legendary HBO drama, closing out its run by becoming the single biggest broadcast the channel had ever aired. Looking across the entire run of the show from beginning to end, this pattern of constant growth stands out as genuinely rare within television. Most extremely popular shows experience their biggest ratings during a single peak season or two, often tied to one specific storyline or plot twist that temporarily pulls in a wave of new or returning viewers before settling back down to more normal levels afterward. Game of Thrones, instead, built a steady, uninterrupted climb that lasted across its entire 8-year run, with each new season pulling in more viewers than the one before it, all the way through to a finale that ended up being the single most watched broadcast the network had ever produced. Very few dramas manage even a few consecutive seasons of growth like this. Managing it across 8 full seasons, ending with the single highest-rated episode the show had ever produced, represents one of the clearest signs of just how strong and lasting the show's connection with its audience really was. It is also worth understanding what these numbers actually represent, since they only cover viewership within the United States through HBO's own domestic platforms. They do not include the massive international audience the show built across dozens of other countries, where it aired through different broadcasters and streaming arrangements outside of HBO's direct American service. They also do not include the enormous piracy numbers discussed earlier, which in some individual seasons rivaled or even outpaced the show's official legal viewership entirely. When all of these separate pieces are considered together, the total number of people around the world who were watching Game of Thrones, by any means available to them, legal or otherwise, domestic or international, almost certainly reached far beyond what any single official ratings report was ever able to capture in one number. What these American ratings figures do prove, clearly and directly, is that Game of Thrones managed something extremely rare for a modern television drama. It did not simply attract a large audience once and then hold on to it. It kept expanding that audience year after year, season after season, right through to the very final episode, ending its run not with a quiet fade, but with the single biggest television night HBO had ever recorded in more than 40 years on the air. That kind of sustained, uninterrupted growth across 8 full seasons says something important about how deeply this particular story managed to hold on to people's attention, pulling in millions of brand new viewers, even in its later years, long after most shows would have already reached their peak and begun settling into a slow decline. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this growth would have meant much if the show had simply been popular within the United States alone. What turned Game of Thrones into a genuinely global phenomenon, one whose finale mattered just as much in living rooms across dozens of other countries as it did in American ones, involved an entirely separate set of international broadcasting decisions, awards, and cultural moments that stretched the show's reach far beyond anything a single country's ratings numbers could ever fully explain on their own. Section 8. A global phenomenon. Beyond the Emmys' Emmy Awards. Only recognize American television, which means the entire record-breaking story covered earlier only tells part of the picture. Game of Thrones was never just an American success. It was built, marketed, and eventually watched as a true worldwide event, and the show's international footprint, both in terms of where it aired and which awards recognized it outside of the Emmys, shows just how far beyond the United States its reputation actually reached. The clearest proof of this global reach came in March of 2015, when HBO made an announcement that had never really been attempted at this scale before. The entire 5th season of Game of Thrones would premiere in over 170 countries and territories around the world at the exact same time it aired in the United States. Michael Lombardo, who was president of HBO programming at the time, described the move as a way to bring one of the most universally loved television shows in the world to global audiences simultaneously, rather than staggering the release across different countries over weeks or months, the way many international shows had traditionally been distributed. This simulcast was made possible through a wide network of partners, including HBO-branded channels operating in different regions, such as HBO Asia, HBO Canada, HBO Europe, HBO Latin America, HBO Netherlands, and HBO Nordic, along with international broadcasting partners in specific countries, including Foxtel in Australia, Sky Deutschland, and Sky Italia in Germany and Italy, Orange in France, and DBS in Israel, among many others spread across nearly every populated continent on Earth. This decision was not made purely to celebrate the show's popularity. It was also a direct response to the piracy problem discussed earlier. For years, international fans in countries where the show aired later than in the United States had turned to illegal downloads simply because they did not want to wait days, weeks, or sometimes months to watch a new episode everyone else in the world was already discussing. By making the entire season available everywhere, at the exact same moment, HBO removed one of the biggest reasons people turned to piracy in the first place. Whether this fully solved the piracy problem or not, the fact that a single television show justified building an entirely new global distribution system just to keep up with worldwide demand says a great deal about how large and immediate that demand had become by 2015. Even before that historic simulcast, Game of Thrones had already built up serious momentum outside the United States. In the year leading up to that announcement, the show had become the most searched television program in the entire world on Google, and it was recognized as the single most talked about show on Facebook, within the United States specifically. A notable distinction given that Facebook conversation numbers are usually dominated by broadcast network shows, with much larger built-in domestic audiences than a premium cable drama could typically expect. Beyond simple viewership and search numbers, the show also collected a long list of major awards, completely separate from the Emmys, each representing recognition from a different corner of the entertainment industry. In 2011, during its very first season, the show received a Peabody Award, an honor given for excellence in storytelling that had, at that point, historically leaned toward journalism and documentary-style programming, making the win for a fantasy drama a notable moment on its own. The show also earned 3 Hugo Awards for Best Dramatic Presentation across 3 consecutive years, from 2012 through 2014. The Hugo Awards are given out specifically within the science fiction and fantasy community, voted on by fans of the genre itself rather than by a broader entertainment industry panel, meaning this recognition came directly from the audience most familiar with, judging fantasy storytelling against other major works in the genre. Over the course of its run, the show ultimately picked up 6 Hugo Awards in total. Golden Globe recognition told a similarly strong story. Game of Thrones received 8 total Golden Globe nominations across its run, with 5 of those specifically nominating the show itself for Best Television Series, Drama, spread across the years 2012 and then again from 2015 through 2018. The Golden Globes are voted on by a group of international entertainment journalists, meaning this recognition reflected how the show was being received by press covering entertainment from a global perspective, not simply an American one. The Screen Actors Guild, an organization representing working actors, also recognized the show on 5 separate occasions with SAG Awards, honoring the ensemble performances that had been carefully built by the casting team discussed earlier in this video. Recognition also came from groups representing nearly every other craft involved in making the show. The Directors Guild of America nominated the show's directors 10 separate times, honoring the technical skill behind episodes like Battle of the Bastards. The Writers Guild of America nominated the show's scripts 10 times as well, and in 2013 specifically ranked Game of Thrones as the 40th best written series in the entire history of television, a list covering decades of programming across every genre. The Producers Guild of America nominated the show 8 times, and the Art Directors Guild, an organization honoring the people responsible for building and designing the physical look of a production, nominated the show 8 times as well, reflecting the enormous amount of design work required to build convincing castles, throne rooms, and battlefields across so many different fictional regions. Beyond the major guild organizations, Game of Thrones also picked up recognition from awards bodies focused specifically on science fiction, fantasy, and genre entertainment. It received 34 nominations from the Saturn Awards, an organization dedicated specifically to honoring science fiction, fantasy, and horror productions, making it one of the most nominated shows in that organization's history. It also received 14 nominations from the Satellite Awards, another entertainment industry award group covering film and television, adding every major award and nomination together across its entire run, from the Emmys down through every guild, genre organization, and international group that recognized the show. Game of Thrones ultimately won 272 awards out of 757 total nominations, a win rate that reflects just how consistently the show impressed voters across dozens of completely separate organizations, each judging the show by their own specific standards and areas of expertise. The show's global reputation also earned it a unique honor at the very end of its run, one that had nothing to do with any single episode or season. In November of 2019, several months after the series finale aired, the International Academy of Television Arts and Sciences presented creators David Benioff and D.B. Weiss with the Founders Award at the 47th International Emmy Awards, an organization that specifically honors television programming and achievement from around the entire world, rather than focusing on American productions the way the standard Emmys do. Receiving an award named specifically for honoring the founders and creative leaders of an entire international ceremony placed Benioff and Weiss in a very small group of people recognized at that level, acknowledging their work shaping a show that had become genuinely important to television audiences well beyond American borders. Looking at every piece of this international story together, from the unprecedented decision to simulcast an entire season across more than 170 countries at once, to the Peabody Award earned in its very first season, to the Hugo Awards voted on directly by fantasy fans, to the international recognition at the very end of its run, a clear pattern emerges. Game of Thrones was never treated by the industry as simply a successful American cable drama that happened to also find some viewers overseas. It was treated, consistently and repeatedly, by organizations representing writers, directors, actors, fans, and international broadcasters alike as one of the defining television achievements of its entire era, regardless of which country happened to be watching it or which language it was being watched in. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Winning this much recognition from this many different corners of the entertainment world across 8 years does not happen through marketing alone, and it does not happen purely because a show generates headlines or piracy statistics. Underneath every award, every simulcast deal, and every record-breaking ratings night sat a much simpler and more basic fact, one that explains why any of this recognition existed in the first place. Millions of individual viewers, across dozens of different countries, kept forming the same intense emotional attachment to specific characters and storylines, an attachment strong enough that losing a favorite character partway through the story could genuinely feel, for a significant number of fans, like losing someone real. Section 9. A world where no one is safe. The science of character death. Very few television shows have ever been studied by actual medical researchers the way Game of Thrones eventually was, because the show killed off so many characters, in so many different ways, across so many seasons. It eventually attracted attention from a group of academic researchers who decided to treat the show's fictional body count as a real data set worth analyzing using the same statistical tools normally used to study injury and mortality in the real world. The result was a peer-reviewed scientific paper, published in an actual medical journal, that took the show's reputation for killing characters and turned it into something that could be measured, calculated, and explained with real numbers rather than just discussed casually among fans. The study, titled "Death is Certain, the Time is Not: Mortality and Survival in Game of Thrones," was written by researchers Reidar Lystad and Benjamin Brown and published in the academic journal Injury Epidemiology in December of 2018. Injury Epidemiology is a real scientific publication focused specifically on studying and preventing different kinds of injuries and deaths in the real world, covering topics like car accidents, drug overdoses, falls, drownings, and violence. It is not a publication that normally has any reason to discuss a fictional fantasy television show, which made this particular paper stand out immediately within the world of academic research once it was released. Despite the unusual subject matter, the researchers applied completely standard, legitimate scientific methods to their analysis. The same kinds of statistical tools doctors and public health researchers use to study survival rates and risk factors in real human populations. To carry out the study, the researchers identified 330 important characters who had appeared across the first 7 seasons of the show. For each of these characters, they recorded a range of specific details, including basic background information about the character, exactly how much time passed before that character died, if they died at all, and the precise circumstances surrounding each individual death. Once this information had been gathered, the team used a method called survival analysis, a statistical technique commonly used in medical research to study how long a group of people are likely to survive under certain conditions, and to identify which specific factors make survival more or less likely for different individuals within that group. The results were striking. By the end of the 7th season, 186 of the 330 characters studied, which works out to just over 56%, had already died. In other words, by the time the 7th season had finished airing, researchers found that more than half of every important character who had ever appeared on the show, up to that point, was already dead. Nearly all of these deaths were found to be violent in nature, with the researchers determining that every single death studied, except for 2 specific cases, resulted from some form of injury, burns, or poisoning, rather than from natural causes like old age or illness. Breaking this down further, the most common specific cause of death among the characters studied was violent assault, accounting for 63% of all deaths recorded, followed by deaths connected directly to warfare, accounting for another 24%. Perhaps the most attention-grabbing finding from the entire study involved how quickly characters tended to die after first appearing on screen. The researchers calculated that a character had roughly a 14% chance of dying within the very first hour after being introduced in the show. To put that in perspective, that means that for every 7 new characters introduced across the show's run, on average, one of them could be expected to die within just 60 minutes of first appearing on screen, based purely on the patterns found across the show's first 7 seasons. The researchers also calculated the range of survival times found among the characters studied, discovering that the shortest amount of time any character survived after appearing on screen was just 11 seconds, while the longest surviving character among those who eventually died managed to last 57 hours and 15 minutes of screen time before their death. The median survival time across every character studied, meaning the point at which exactly half of the characters had already died and half had not, came out to 28 hours and 48 minutes of combined screen time across the entire show. The study went even further, looking specifically at what kinds of characters faced a higher or lower risk of dying based on certain traits. The researchers found that characters were significantly more likely to die if they were male rather than female, and if they came from a lower social background within the story, rather than a noble or high-born one. Characters who switched their loyalty from one side to another during the story were actually found to have a lower risk of dying compared to characters who remained loyal to a single side throughout. A specific, measurable pattern the researchers were able to calculate directly from the data they had gathered. Interestingly, the researchers noted that this particular pattern, where switching sides seemed to improve a character's odds of survival, does not necessarily match how similar situations tend to play out in real historical conflicts, where switching loyalties often carries its own serious risks rather than offering any kind of extra protection. The researchers also pointed out a real-world connection buried within their findings. They noted that the pattern they found, where male characters and lower-born characters faced a higher risk of violent death within the show, actually lines up with real-world data on human violence. where homicide rates tend to be higher in areas with lower income levels, and where a very large majority of homicide victims in real life, roughly 80% according to the research the study referenced, are male. While the researchers were careful to clarify that findings from a fictional show cannot be directly applied to real-world policy or real human behavior, they noted that this specific overlap between the fictional patterns in the show and known patterns of real-world violence was worth pointing out as an interesting parallel. A separate group of researchers conducted a similar study around the same time, publishing their own analysis of character deaths through a research platform called Archive. This second study looked at a slightly different group of 132 characters, followed for a median time of 32 episodes, and found that 89 of those characters, or roughly 67%, ultimately died over the course of the show. This second study identified external injury as the leading cause of death, accounting for just over 42% of all deaths recorded, and found that a character's age, calculated in decades, was a measurable factor connected to their overall risk of dying. Even though the two separate studies used slightly different groups of characters and slightly different specific numbers, both arrived at a similar overall conclusion: that a clear majority of important characters introduced across the show's run ultimately ended up dead by violent means, and that specific, identifiable patterns could be found within exactly which kinds of characters tended to survive longer than others. These academic studies existed almost entirely separate from how ordinary fans experienced these same deaths in real time, watching them unfold live on their television screens, rather than analyzing them afterward through spreadsheets and statistical models. Nowhere did that gap between cold data and raw emotional reaction show up more clearly than during a single episode from Season 3, an episode titled The Reigns of Castamere, which fans quickly nicknamed The Red Wedding after it aired in June of 2013. Within that single episode, several major characters were killed in a sudden, coordinated betrayal during what had been presented as a wedding celebration, including Robb Stark, who had spent the show's first 3 seasons being set up as one of its central young leaders, along with his mother Catelyn Stark and his wife Talisa. The reaction to this single episode became one of the clearest, most documented examples of just how emotionally invested real audiences had become in these fictional characters. Within hours of the episode airing, the social media platform, then known as Twitter, was flooded with reactions from ordinary viewers and celebrities alike, and the show continued trending on that platform for several days afterward, as people continued processing what they had just watched. Actress Elizabeth Banks, known for her role in a separate major film franchise, publicly described feeling completely shattered by the episode. Actress Troian Bellisario spoke about how deeply the episode had affected her overall mood afterward. Even members of the show's own cast reacted publicly to the episode once it aired, with actress Lena Headey, who played Cersei Lannister on the show, sharing that watching the scene had brought her to tears, despite already being deeply familiar with the story from working on the production herself. What makes The Red Wedding especially interesting from a factual standpoint is that the deaths within that episode were not simply shocking twists invented purely for television. They were based directly on events already written in George R.R. Martin's original book series, meaning readers of the books had known this event was coming for years before it ever aired on screen. Despite that advanced knowledge existing among book readers, the television adaptation made several specific changes, designed to intensify the emotional impact of the scene even further compared to how it had been written on the page, including the addition of the character Talisa, who did not exist in the same form within the original novels, and whose presence and pregnancy at the moment of the betrayal added an additional layer of tragedy specifically built for the show's version of the event. This detail matters because it shows the emotional impact of The Red Wedding was not simply a natural result of adapting existing source material directly onto the screen. The show's creators made deliberate, specific choices about how to stage and present that betrayal. Choices clearly built around maximizing the emotional reaction from an audience watching the story unfold for the very first time. That emotional reaction did not fade quickly, and it did not stay confined to the week the episode originally aired. Years later, footage and discussion of viewers experiencing the Red Wedding for the first time continued circulating widely online, particularly through video sharing platforms, where people recorded their genuine, unscripted reactions while watching the episode. One such video, showing an ordinary viewer's reaction to the episode, was viewed more than 2.5 million times after being shared online, drawing sympathetic responses from viewers who recognized and related to that same overwhelming sense of shock from their own first time watching the episode years earlier. This kind of sustained, ongoing reaction to a single episode, continuing to circulate and resonate with new viewers years after it originally aired, reflects something important about how deeply this specific moment embedded itself into the broader cultural memory surrounding the show, well beyond its original broadcast audience back in 2013. Taken together, the academic research and the real-world audience reaction tell two different but connected parts of the same underlying story. The peer-reviewed studies prove, through actual statistical analysis, that character death on Game of Thrones followed real, measurable, identifiable patterns, with more than half of all important characters dying by violent means, and specific traits, like gender and social status, genuinely affecting a character's calculated risk of death within the story. The audience reactions prove something the statistics alone cannot fully capture, that these numbers represented real emotional stakes for millions of individual viewers, each of whom had formed genuine attachments to specific characters, only to watch those same characters die suddenly, violently, and often without warning, exactly as the underlying statistical patterns suggested was likely to happen sooner or later to almost anyone in this particular story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Very few shows in television history have ever managed to build a world where losing a major character felt like a real, unpredictable possibility at almost any moment, rather than something reserved only for a dramatic season finale or a clearly signaled turning point in the plot. Game of Thrones built that specific sense of danger directly into its basic storytelling structure, so consistently and so thoroughly that actual scientists eventually felt it was worth studying, using the same tools normally reserved for understanding real human mortality. That willingness to treat no character as permanently safe, regardless of how important they seemed to the overall story, shaped not just how audiences experienced individual episodes, but how an entire generation of newer television shows would eventually approach the basic question of which of their own characters were allowed to survive. Section 10. Setting the benchmark. The industry still chases. Every record covered so far in this video happened while Game of Thrones was still on the air. What makes the show's story genuinely unusual is that its influence did not stop once the series ended in 2019. Years after the finale aired, the show is still actively shaping decisions being made across the television industry. And the clearest proof of that lasting influence comes from a show built specifically to try to recapture some of what Game of Thrones had already accomplished. That show is House of the Dragon, a prequel series set roughly 200 years before the events of the original story, based on a separate book by George R.R. Martin called Fire and Blood, which tells the earlier history of House Targaryen. When House of the Dragon premiered on August 21, 2022, it immediately became the largest audience for any new original series in the entire history of HBO. The premiere episode drew 9.986 million viewers across HBO's traditional broadcast and its HBO Max streaming service combined, a number that instantly beat every previous debut episode HBO had ever launched, including the original Game of Thrones itself, which had premiered back in 2011 with only 4.2 million viewers. In other words, a spin-off prequel series built around characters and events most casual viewers had never heard of before, opened to more than double the audience the original show itself had managed on its very first night, more than a decade earlier. This premiere success stretched well beyond the United States as well. Warner Bros. Discovery, the company that owns HBO, confirmed that House of the Dragon also became HBO Max's biggest series launch across Latin America and across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, regions where the streaming service was available at the time. In the United Kingdom specifically, the premiere drew 1.39 million viewers within its first 24 hours on the broadcaster Sky, a number large enough to make it the biggest drama launch Sky Atlantic had ever recorded, surpassing even the original Game of Thrones premiere on that same channel years earlier. Interest in the new prequel also caused a measurable spike in attention toward the original series all over again. In the weeks leading up to House of the Dragon's premiere, Warner Bros. Discovery reported that overall audience engagement with the original 8-season Game of Thrones series had grown 90% higher compared to just 7 weeks earlier, meaning a huge number of viewers were going back to revisit or discover the original show for the first time, specifically because a new prequel was about to arrive. This pattern shows something important about how the franchise had grown beyond a single finished television show. Even years after its ending, Game of Thrones still had enough pull to send audiences back to re-watch it the moment any new related content was announced, treating the original series less like a finished, closed story and more like a permanent, ongoing world that people kept returning to. House of the Dragon's success did not stop with its first season. When its second season premiered in 2024, it drew 7.8 million viewers across all platforms on its opening night, a strong number on its own, even though it came in about 22% below the record-setting debut from 2 years earlier. Season 1 of House of the Dragon ended up averaging 29 million viewers per episode, once every platform was counted over a 90-day measurement window, which made it the highest-performing HBO series average since the original Game of Thrones had ended, a record that held briefly until a separate HBO series called The Last of Us surpassed it in early 2023 by averaging more than 30 million viewers across its own run. By the time House of the Dragon reached its third season in 2026, the show pulled in 21.5 million views during its first 3 days of streaming, continuing to draw a massive audience, even years after the franchise's flagship series had already concluded. Beyond ratings, HBO's decision to keep building out the world of Westeros reflects a broader business reality created directly by the original show's success. Warner Bros. Discovery has confirmed plans for a Game of Thrones feature film focused on events surrounding Aegon's conquest, an earlier chapter of the fictional history referenced throughout the original series, along with multiple additional Game of Thrones-related shows reportedly in development for the years ahead. A network does not commit this many resources to expanding a single fictional universe unless the original property has already proven, through hard viewership numbers rather than guesswork, that audiences are willing to keep coming back to that specific world again and again, across different shows, different casts, and different specific storylines within the same overall setting. The influence of Game of Thrones reached well beyond HBO's own decisions about its own franchise. Once the original show proved that a fantasy drama could achieve the kind of massive global viewership, critical respect, and awards recognition documented throughout this entire video, other networks and streaming services responded by investing heavily in their own large-scale fantasy productions, hoping to capture even a portion of what Game of Thrones had built. Amazon's streaming service produced The Rings of Power, a series set within the world created by author J.R.R. Tolkien, reportedly built around one of the largest television budgets ever assembled, with the full season budget reaching roughly $715 million, and around $465 million of that total going specifically toward the first 8 episodes alone. Very few networks would have committed that level of spending to a fantasy series before Game of Thrones had already demonstrated, season after season and record after record, that audiences were genuinely willing to support this kind of ambitious, expensive storytelling on a weekly basis. Looking back across every piece of this story, From the very first modest ratings numbers back in 2011, through the record-breaking Emmy wins, the historic piracy numbers, the ballooning production budgets, the tourism transformation of entire cities and islands, the unusual casting philosophy, and the academic study of its own body count, one consistent thread runs through the entire 8-year run of Game of Thrones. Nearly every single measurement anyone has ever tried to use to judge the size or importance of a television show, whether that measurement came from television critics, industry award voters, ordinary fans, academic researchers, or local tourism officials working thousands of miles away from any film studio, ended up showing the same basic result. This was not simply a popular show that came and went during its own particular era of television. It became a genuine benchmark, a reference point that other networks, other producers, and other shows have continued measuring themselves against for years after its own story had already reached its final episode. That kind of lasting influence, still shaping decisions made by entirely different companies, working on entirely different shows, years after Game of Thrones itself stopped producing new episodes, is the clearest possible proof of just how far this one particular story managed to travel. Starting from a modest fantasy drama that HBO once approached with real caution, and ending as one of the defining pieces of television that an entire industry has spent years since trying, in one way or another, to recreate. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.